Let's turn to some news and some politics. New this morning, President Obama reportedly will make good on his promise earlier this month that there will be consequences to what intelligence agencies say was Russian interference in the U.S. presidential election. The Washington Post reports the administration readying its response. Anonymous officials say likely will involve covert cyber operations. The Post also reports that the public consequences could be announced as early as this week, with officials seeking to broaden the president's authority to freeze U.S. assets and impose travel restrictions on the suspects involved. The effort could involve broadening an April 2015 executive order that gave the president authority to respond to foreign hackers who harm economic or national security, possibly by expanding the definition to declare electoral systems part of the critical infrastructure of the United States. According to the Post, the administration wants to make the new punishments, quote, public or communicated to Congress in a form that would be difficult for President-elect Trump to simply walk back once in office. Also this morning, the Russian government alleges President Obama is trying to hamstring his successor by signing the National Defense Authorization Act. The $619 billion bill was passed by veto-proof majorities in both the House and the Senate earlier this month. And in part, it renews restrictions on Russia for aggression in Eastern Europe and increases aid to Ukraine. In a statement, the Russian Foreign Ministry said, quote, overall, it appears the Authorization Act has been adopted by the outgoing Obama administration to create problems for the incoming Trump administration and complicate its relations on the international stage, as well as to force it to adopt an anti-Russia policy. This policy has brought the current U.S. administration, which believed Russia would bow to pressure, into a dead end. We hope the new administration will be more sagacious, end quote. Leading Republican senators, including Armed Services Chairman John McCain, are currently visiting NATO allies and urging a tougher stance on Russia. And Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina says Trump is out of step with the Senate and is calling for action in response to cyber warfare.
100 United States senators. I would say that 99 of us believe the Russians did this, and we're going to do something about it. Along with Senator McCain, after this trip's over, we're going to have the hearings, and we're going to put sanctions together that hit Putin as an individual and his inner circle for interfering in our election.
I think he will be, when presented with the overwhelming evidence, change his view. But on the issue of the Russians, I mean, there is no doubt about it, and we have to act, and we have to have a policy which this administration does not have, and a strategy which this administration does not have, and address this threat to our national security.
For more on this, let's bring in NBC News Chief Global Correspondent Bill Neely. He is live in London. Bill, a lot to digest here. What more could you tell us?
Yeah, good morning, Willie. I mean, clearly we are at one of those hinge points in history, aren't we? Or at least pivot points in the U.S. relationship with Russia. Here we are in the dying days of the Obama administration. We have an attempt to make sure that what happened at the last election never happens again, the hacking of the American political system by a hostile rival. We know there are sanctions in place already to cover commercial companies, parts of the U.S. infrastructure, but I guess no one imagined that a state might actually try to interfere with a national election. So no measures were put in place to deter or punish any country that tried to do that. So now apparently we're going to get some measures and also measures that will prevent President Trump from killing these new measures. But I suppose two questions spring to my mind, Willie. First of all, who are the hackers, and how do you freeze the assets of people or institutions or groups that you don't know? And here we go again with sanctions. I mean, how many more sanctions can be possibly effective against Russia? President Obama says there are already an enormous number of sanctions. Have they deterred Russia's questionable behavior in a whole array of areas? No. So, you know, we are at a pivot point here. Will President Trump continue any of these policies, or will he desperately reset relations with Russia and leave what happened in the hacking of the Democratic Party behind? That's what we don't know yet. 23 days, we'll know.
President Obama trying to make it more difficult for Donald Trump to do that. Bill Neely in London for us this morning. Bill, thanks so much.
Sam Stein, I'm wondering what goes through your mind when you hear that Washington, the Obama administration, intends to take covert action against the Russians for their role in interfering in our election, and they announce it publicly. You announce covert action publicly.
Well, what goes through my mind is it's probably too little and way too late. As Bill noted, we already have a fairly robust sanctions regime against Russia. The Russian economy's suffered in part because of that, in part because of the drop in oil price. So it's not entirely clear what the economic leverage we have is. But beyond that, even if we were to put this in place, it's also not clear what would prevent Donald Trump from ripping it up. It's also well beyond the point where confidence in our democracy has been tested, if not shattered, for a lot of people, and where from Obama's perspective, his legacy, his political legacy that he built up for 8 years, is now at great risk. So yeah, I mean, the punishment probably does need to come down, but the cost that was incurred to get to this point is massive for President Obama, and a lot of people looking now say, where was the action prior to November 8th? What took so long? Also, I do want to see a public accounting, a more thorough public accounting of what exactly transpired. And within 23 days, I'm not sure the intelligence community can or will put something that comprehensive out and together that would allow us to understand exactly what transpired and why it did happen.
And I think, what we learn about that, to that point, is going to depend a lot on what happens with, we played Senator Lindsey Graham and John McCain talking about this, and they are extraordinarily focused on it, starting with the hacking, but also, more broadly to the actions that Russia has taken in the Ukraine and elsewhere in threatening ways. But they are already shaping up to be a little bit at odds with Mitch McConnell, who wants to keep this, procedurally in the Intelligence Committee, which essentially means he wants to be able to keep more of it behind closed doors. And Graham and McCain want to do these more aggressive investigations. McCain wants to have a subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee to kind of push more of this out there and to try to set them up at odds with Donald Trump. I mean, they do not think that the way President-elect Trump has talked about this is healthy for the country. McConnell has sort of erred on the side of protecting Trump.
You're spot on, Casey, and because what we're watching is not only a foreign policy standoff between the U.S. and Russia, but a foreign policy standoff between the president-elect, and even some Republicans in Congress. And I think the dynamic, especially people on the inside of Trump's orbit, they're unhappy right now with the White House. I was speaking to some of them last night. They said, yes, they did start to act on foreign policy with regard to the UN resolution in Israel, and this is usually a quiet period for the president-elect, but they have been wading into foreign policy. But now that they're unhappy with how the Obama administration is moving forward with Russia, because as much as it gets joked about, Trump really does see world order in a different way, and Russia in a starkly different way than most other Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah, and Rick, so part of this, yes, about punishing Russia, but another half of it from the White House is about preparing for the next administration and what they believe changes might be coming in the relationship from Donald Trump and Russia.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, the president said, I think as recently as yesterday, said he was going to be quiet for a while. Yet while he's leaving, he's doing all these things. But I think they're going to have the opposite effect, actually. I think elections are about change. This election certainly was about change. And he is drawing the contrast of that change even more starkly, because President-elect Trump will have the opportunity to solidify his relationship with Bibi Netanyahu and Israel with the UN vote that just occurred. And here again, presidents can do enormous things with regard to foreign policy to reverse what Donald Trump is going to do. And similarly with putting part of the Atlantic Ocean off limits to oil drilling, I've read forever. It's not forever. It could easily be reversed. So I'm not sure why President Obama wants to engage in all these actions that can be, I think, relatively easily undone.
One reason he might want to engage is that it's not just our election that was compromised, but there's future elections, for instance, in Germany and France. And he might look at the international order and say, okay, Russia meddled with our democracy, but we better hope that Angela Merkel, who he has basically endorsed for re-election, we better hope that they don't do the same in Germany. So let's try to put a light on what happened so it doesn't happen again.
But
he might be thinking down the road for
investigation. There's going to be
Yes.
a congressional investigation. Why not just wait for the investigation and see what?
Because it's
what it
unclear.
produces?
What's
It
gonna
becomes
come out of
a
that
lot harder for
investigation.
Trump to undo something publicly. If you announce an action against Russia publicly before you leave office, it becomes a little bit harder for Trump to undo it without looking like a stooge of Russia. So maybe that's their thinking.
Robert, you mentioned Donald Trump has a very, very different view of the world order than does Barack Obama. Spell that out a little. What's his world view?
Well, when you look at the consensus in Washington among both Republicans and Democrats, there's a hawkish position, generally speaking, toward Vladimir Putin and Russia and their intervention in Western Europe and Eastern Europe and their role in the world. With Trump, he sees the world in almost a tribal way, and he does not think world order needs to be applied in the same way Republican hawks see it. And so with Russia, he thinks Russia, as I've been explained to it by several Trump insiders, is he sees Russia as a way to have a new relationship with China. For example, if he wants to go after China on currency manipulation, on different kinds of trade deals, having a stronger relationship with Russia in his private, personal view would make that kind of negotiation have a different dynamic. Same with negotiations with other countries. And he thinks not only Russians petroleum reserves, but its projection in the world, if he brought it in as more of an ally, regardless of its intervention perhaps in the U.S. election, it would have benefits for U.S. negotiating. But again, he's against the wall in many respects with his own party.
So Casey, Donald Trump, please meet John McCain.
Yeah, well, and look, I mean, a lot of these Republicans are careful about how they talk about Donald Trump domestically speaking, right? McCain ran for re-election. He wasn't out there every day trashing Donald Trump. He needed a lot of these Trump voters. But Russia is a place where it's not clear that Donald Trump lines up with a lot of his voters. And a lot of Republicans have this sense that this might be a place where he is out of step with the electorate. And, you know, Marco Rubio is a good example of this. He was one of the only Republicans who, during the election, was out there saying, hey, Republicans, this could happen to you. Stop, saying that this is fine and that we're going to read John Podesta's emails. And I think he's picking up on something that's very real, and Bob touched on it, which is, Republicans do not feel like Vladimir Putin is a good guy. And this, what McCain and Graham are doing here, right? Fair. McCain and Graham, are essentially out there saying they're able to talk about this issue in a way that sets them up against Trump without having to say it out loud. They can, by taking these actions, by flying across the country, going to Ukraine, saying, look at all these things Vladimir Putin is doing. They are talking to and about Donald Trump without saying his name.
What I liked about the McCain and Graham appearance, where they said 99 senators, or 99% of the Senate agrees with us that Putin meddled with the election.
Who's the one?
Who's the one? I got to know. Who's the one?